Flak shreds the sky, a B-17G spins, and a waist gunner hits a German beat field hard enough to taste dirt, then spits, captured, not conquered. That sounds insane until you see the scale. About 94,000 Americans were taken by the Germans, and roughly 1% died in captivity. Survival was not luck. It was habit. Training made the first shield name, rank, serial number, and culture made the second. Act like a unit, even when you're alone. At Dulag Luft near Frankfurt, interrogators tried kindness, silence, and soft eyes, but airmen answered with drills. On the rail cars east, rookies practiced the catechism under their breath. By the time they reached Stalag Luft III at Sagan, or Stalag Luft I at Bath on the Baltic, they were no longer scattered strangers. They were a system, looking for work. It started with food. Red Cross parcels, spam, Klim powdered milk, cigarettes, chocolate arrived like little supply drops from home. Instead of hoarding, Americans built a sharing economy. The sick ate first. A tin stove became a kitchen, a blanket became a screen for shadow shows, a table became an altar on Sundays. A corporal inventor cut vent holes with a mess kit spoon and taught 3 huts to copy his stove in an afternoon. The guards watched men starving, laughing and organizing, and muttered, Amerikaner Ordnung, American order, because discipline under hunger is a weapon. A single diary could turn into a manual. 2 spoonfuls of Klim in porridge keeps the shakes away. Don't walk the yard without a buddy. Trade 1 bar of chocolate for 3 slices of bread when the baker's wife is on shift. Tiny rules saved lives. The camp slang said the rest. Kriegies, temporary guests, men who swapped P-51D stories like ball players and treated roll call as a formation, not a humiliation. A chaplain read psalms with a voice like gravel. An ex-shortstop led calisthenics for skeletons with smiles. The shock is simple. In the coldest winter of the war, men who fell from the sky got up and built a town behind wire. The next shock is bigger. That town will soon out-organize its jailers and call in a ride home on 4 roaring engines. And the numbers back the feeling. 1 man in 100 didn't make it, which means 99 in 100 did, because small acts add up. They timed roll calls. They logged calories. They kept a list of the weakest men by bunk and row. That is how a nation shows up, even without a flag. A single page moves hand to hand in a freezing hut at Stalag Luft I, typed on a salvaged ribbon. POW wow prisoners of war. Waiting on winning. It is a newspaper without a press, fed by a hidden radio and fresh arrivals who memorize BBC bulletins. Truth becomes a ration. Men read, breathe, and pass it along because news is oxygen. The Germans search, seize, and shrug. By nightfall, another sheet appears. Classes bloom because hope needs homework. Algebra in barracks 6, French verbs in 7, a navigation refresher in 8 for the day someone straps into a cockpit again. Theatre lights glow from tin and wire. A chaplain turns a Red Cross parcel into communion. A former stagehand rigs a footlight and calls places. The schedule looks like a small American town. Elected spokesman to talk to the commandant, sanitation teams with soap rations, quiet hours so the sick can sleep. An honor rule guards the last can of Klim, the feverish eat first. A. P. Clark at Stalag Luft III signs notes, big S, and inventories compasses, forgery plates, and civilian coats. He writes in a pilot's calm voice about security drills, search signals, and the way good paperwork beats brute force. Across the wire, young Americans learn the craft of order. They build a chain of trust that runs faster than fear. Every confiscated map is replaced within 2 days. Every informer rumor is checked, logged, and quietly cut out like a splinter. Pilot James Bainham will later say, "We couldn't wait to get a taste of freedom, but the truth is, they were practicing it all along. Each parcel shared, each class held, each joke whispered at midnight said the same thing. You can fence a man, but you cannot fence his habits. The guards, competent and cold, begin to understand they are outnumbered by a culture. If a free press survives behind barbed wire, imagine what happens when 4 engines arrive from the west. Numbers give the picture weight. By the spring of 1945, roughly 7,700 Americans crowded Stalag Luftwaffe's north and south compounds, with roll calls stretching across the sand and wind off the Baltic cutting to the bone. Barracks had triple-tier bunks, pot-bellied stoves, and windows stuffed with paper against drafts. Mail days turned huts into quiet oceans of letters, each one read twice, then folded like a relic. When the radio said the front was moving, a buzz ran the length of the fence like current in wire. A door bangs at Dulag Luft, and an interrogator slides a file across the table, already stuffed with the kind of facts that rattle a flyer, names, targets, even a hometown baseball score. Problem: can a lone, bruised American win a mind game built by professionals? Answer: yes, because training turns fear into drills, name, rank, serial. While leaders seed tiny tactics that work, fix your eyes on a knot in the wood when you feel talk rising. Ask for a chaplain instead of small talk. Never confirm a fact by flinching. On the rail cars east, veterans coach rookies in whispers, tapping knuckles for Morse when guards pass. By the time the men file into Sagan's south compound or Bath's north 2, they are no longer scattered. They are a net. The net catches people before they fall. A new arrival gets a bunk, a buddy, and a job before his first night ends. Forgery teams need runners. The library needs a ledger. The food board needs a calorie book, so the sick get the best of the parcels. A quiet staff sergeant, a former grocer, becomes the quartermaster of nothing, counting tins and building menus that turn scarcity into math. A teacher draws a sectional chart on brown paper and quizzes navigators on winds aloft, like it still matters because it does. The interrogators plan to harvest loose words. Instead, they meet a culture that treats the wire like a temporary workplace. A. P. Clark calls himself Big S and writes, "The task of getting our money, false travel papers, tools, compasses, maps and civilian clothing through the search would be a formidable one." It is formidable, and the men still do it. Inside the compounds, a security section flags suspicious behavior quietly. A code phrase, "How's the soup?" asks if a hut has been searched. Guard captains, competent and wary, adjust their approach. They split roll calls, vary search times, and still find themselves behind. They are up against something larger than any one prisoner. American routine. The cell at Dulag Luft was supposed to break the will. Instead, it became a hallway the men walked through. The question changes from, will they talk? To, how do we move them? And the answer, soon enough, is brutal. March them west and hope the cold does the work the questions could not. Snow slants like knife points on 27 January 1945, as guards empty Stalag Luft III into the night, 11,000 prisoners, boots squeaking, wagon teams hauling men who cannot feel their feet. Americans answer the blizzard with a plan. Buddy pairs, timed rests, pooled rations, and a rule carved into the cold nobody gets left. Texans trade socks, New Yorkers barter cigarettes for bread, Midwesterners pull rope like farm kids dragging hay. The route clicks like a metronome. Sagan to Bad Muskau, a few hours of sleep on church floors, then Spremberg railhead, where frost steams off coats. There are no decorations on a road like this, only 1,000 tiny acts of sanity. A medic divides sulfur into equal piles, so infections don't run, and wild. A corporal measures paces and writes distances in a notebook to prove progress to men who have forgotten what a mile feels like. A chaplain times prayers to the rhythm of steps, so words warm as much as breath. At each stop, Americans build a soup line out of buckets and a fire out of splinters, and somehow the line moves again. German officers bark, then bargain. because the only way a column this big makes miles is if the prisoners help run it like a unit. The irony hangs in the air like fog. The captors now depend on American order. At Moosburg Stalag 7A, the crowd swells under barbed wire into a living map of the Allied world, uniforms from Kansas to Krakow, shoulder to shoulder. U.S. Deaths in German hands sit roughly at 1 in 100, a number written in frostbite and grit, in Red Cross calories and the math of discipline. The march was meant to scatter morale to the wind. Instead, it concentrated American will in places that mattered. From there, the next act could be staged. The men do not know it yet, but a fighter ace named Hubert Hub Zemke will soon make a choice at a camp on the Baltic that turns order into leverage. And far to the west, 4 engines wait for their new mission. Polish civilians slip hot water to the rear of the column when guards look away. A German baker's wife trades 3 heel ends of bread for a single American cigarette. Someone ties rags around a friend's ankles where boots have split. A wagon wheel breaks, 6 men lift, 2 men brace, and the march keeps time again, a grim drumbeat heading west. Bart sits on the Baltic like a grey postcard, and Stalag Luftwaffe turns strangely quiet as towers thin and guards slip away. Inside, Kol, Hubert Hub Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group, weighs an evacuation order and refuses to move, calculating that staying put will save lives. His logic is ruthless and kind. Chaos kills faster than bullets in a collapsing empire. Into crossfires. Americans paint armbands, inventory the sick, secure the parcel stores, and post their own sentries. They turn a prison into a protected zone with a US heartbeat. The paperwork is as important as the fence. Roles are verified, medical cases prioritized, spokesmen assigned by block and barracks. Engineers pace the airfield and mark hazards with lime. If an airplane comes, nobody will be under a prop. A radio team, quiet as cats, keeps listening for the rumble from the west. German officers recognize the shift and start asking Americans for help keeping order. The keys, literal and symbolic, begin to change hands. When the Red Army arrives, the camp looks like a ledger squared to the last line. Who is weak? Who can walk? Who must ride? Which huts have fuel? Which need guards? A young pilot jokes, "We're running this place like a squadron," and nobody laughs because it's true. James Bainham will later say, "We couldn't wait to get a taste of freedom, and the air tastes like salt and coal smoke and spring thaw." The question hanging over the wire is bigger than any gate. How do you move thousands from a Baltic backwater to home when bridges are blown and rails are jammed? There is only one nation in May 1945 with crews, fuel, runways, and will to answer. The same force that bombed by day will now save by day, and the field at Bath is ready to prove it. Zemke's resume carries weight. P-47 Thunderbolts, the 56th Wolfpack, a leader who taught killers to fly like craftsmen. He applies the same craft to captivity. Armbands stenciled Amerikansky in block letters go to litter teams so Soviet soldiers know who they are helping. A signal's corporal chalks traffic lanes from the main gate to the dispersal pads. A medic taps a list on a clipboard. Fevers first, trench foot second, frostbite next. Then the men who can climb on their own. Somewhere in that order is the quiet victory. Nobody gets trampled when the miracle arrives. Engines thunder over the Baltic as 8th Air Force flips its script. Between 13 and 15 May 1945, B-17, flying fortresses drop into Bath, not with bombs, but with mercy. Operation Revival turns steel and fuel into grace at scale. Nearly 8,500 Allied POWs, thousands of them Americans, airlifted out in roughly 450 flights. Crew chiefs strip guns to make space, lash canvas for seats, and chalk weight limits on bulkheads where bomb loads once glowed in grease pencil. A Kriegi grabs the waist window and whispers, "Best seat in Europe," and the pilot answers with a thumbs up you can feel in your chest. The choreography is American to the bone. Ground teams test the field, mark taxi lines, and park fortresses like buses. Medics set triage at dispersal pads. Quartermasters turn parcel stores into staging areas. Cooks crack open tins so protein hits bloodstream before wheels up. A radio crackles call signs and tail numbers as if the war never ended, just changed verbs from destroy to deliver. The smell is oil and sea and hot aluminum. The numbers feel impossible until you remember the factories behind them. Willow Run once rolled a B-24 Liberator off the line every 63 minutes. Detroit and Seattle taught America to bend metal like wheat. That muscle now flexes for rescue. In 3 days, the air bridge empties a prison. Former guards lean on fence posts and watch the armada lift, understanding that a nation which can bomb by day can also save by day, and that this second power is the one that breaks your will. Survivors weigh in at 128 pounds and go home at 170. A doctor scribbles notes: edema, fading, colour returning, appetite fierce. On the last afternoon, a crew chief slaps the flank of his fortress like a workhorse and says, "One more." It is. And it isn't because the ride home is the last mission of a war America won by force and, just as loudly, by abundance. The engines climb, the Baltic slides away, freedom hums at 2,300 revolutions per minute. A fortress with a triangle A on the tail taxis past men who once watched that mark from prison windows and dreamed. Ground crews swap coffee for smiles, while jackets become cushions. A navigator lays his E6B on a knee out of habit and grins because the course is simple. West, then home. Somewhere below, Zemke's armbands flash white in the sun, guiding litters to ramps without a stumble. Proof that leadership still matters when the shooting stops. The sound says one thing to every ear on that field: we're going home, together. The armada is gone, but the lesson lingers in the huts they left behind. American power works because American order works, even when the tools are a pencil stub and a Red Cross tin. In Stalag Luft III and Stalag Luft III, the Americans had built a shadow city mess lines that ran on the minute, sanitation teams that mapped latrines, education hours that felt like fall semester. That city produced outcomes the enemy could count. Thousands of men still standing at roll call after a winter meant to erase them. Guards who once sneered at Kriegies began consulting their spokesman to keep the compounds calm, a quiet admission that control had crossed the wire. Men from the 8th and 15th Air Forces, men who once flew B-17 seconds, B-24 seconds, and P-51Ds, ran their barracks like squadrons' morning routines, maintenance of kit, mutual checks on the sick because that was the American habit. Listen to A. P. Clark's matter-of-fact voice as he inventories what a free mind can accomplish in a cage: false travel papers that looked right at a glance, compasses in boot heels, and maps on silk squares that would not sog in rain. He did not promise miracles. He promised process. Across the sand, a quiet grocer from Ohio served as quartermaster of rations, counting clim spoons with the precision of a depot clerk. A former stagehand wired footlights. A chaplain logged the fevers. A farm kid from Iowa made a stove from a tin, and a bomber navigator chalked a schedule on a board like a flight line. It reads like small stuff until you see the number that came out the other end. Roughly 1 American in 100 died in German captivity, a loss that hurts, but a survival rate that tells you the system held. James Bainham's Memory of Liberation carries the truth in a single sentence. We couldn't wait to get a taste of freedom, because freedom had been rehearsed daily under the towers. Germans sensed it too. When food ran tight, the Americans' rotation plan kept the worst cases alive. When rumors ran hot, the Americans' rumor board cooled them with facts. Even the smuggling of news POW passed from hand to hand wasn't bravado, it was logistics, a supply chain for morale. The enemy's shock was not theatrical, it was technical. The Americans had turned captivity into a manageable problem set, then solved it with checklists. That is why the B-17 pickups worked. You cannot load thousands in days unless the men at the fence arrive at the field in order, with litters staged, with lanes marked, with names ready. The 4 engines left skid marks and salvation, but the real miracle was already printed in pencil on a barracks board. Monday roll call, classes, worship. Tuesday search drill, parcel tally. Wednesday medical rounds, rumour check. Thursday ready to fly, whenever freedom lands. Back in Germany, the sight of the emptied compounds rippled through garrison towns that had counted on wire to prove control. The towers stood, but the system behind them had failed, and everyone could tell. In airfields from Bath to Lübeck, the math of the American rescue kept stacking up. 3 days, nearly 8,500 Allied POWs evacuated, about 450 B-17 flights cycling like city buses. Crew chiefs who had once chalked bomb loads now chalked bodies and blankets. Medics staged litters in the order set by the camp's own medical teams. Cooks opened parcels and made quick broth so men did not shock their systems. Navigators tuned in beacons and plotted west with an E-6B, muscle memory from missions that had shattered the Reich's factories, now saving American lives at industrial scale. The volume felt unreal, but it matched the country that produced it. This was the same nation whose Willow Run plant had produced one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes at peak, whose shipyards had slid Liberty ships down the ways in weeks, whose auto lines had turned Detroit into an arsenal. The men who stepped onto those bombers understood that their ride home was not a gift from luck. It was a dividend from process, paid out in aluminum and octane. A radio operator found himself counting sorties as if he were back on mission. Triangle A down, square P next. The old tail codes, now a roll call for mercy. One pilot joked, "We're flying the easiest formation of the war straight to home." And the ground crews laughed because the toughest part had already been done behind the wire. Former guards stared because they saw the larger truth. A country that can repurpose a strategic bombing fleet in days is a country that is very hard to beat, even after the shooting stops. The Baltic wind picked up the smell of oil and hot brakes as each fortress turned to the runway and lifted, heavy with men who had memorized the sound of a Pratt & Whitney like a lullaby. In a field infirmary, a doctor noted weight gains week by week, 128 to 142 to 160 numbers, that look dry until you see cheeks filling, uniforms cinched looser, eyes bright. Zemke's men cleared the last dispersal pad and packed the final chalk, and the runway fell silent. The enemy's last emotion was not hatred, it was comprehension. They had been beaten by a nation that could move from destruction to rescue without changing the tempo. That is what American supremacy looks like up close. Process that performs, compassion that scales, airplanes that come when you call. Now, widen the lens, and the story becomes a map of American reach. Those thousands, lifted from the Baltic, were plucked by the same air forces that had flown daylight formations over the Ruhr. B-17G, flying fortresses with chin turrets and B-24 Jules, Liberators with Davis wings had smashed the industrial core that fed the German war machine. P-51D Mustangs, the long-range Cadillacs of the sky, had ridden shotgun all the way to Berlin. That triad heavy bombers, long-range escorts, disciplined crews did not just win air superiority, it created a logistics highway where mercy could travel at bomber speed. The proof is on the pages of camp notebooks. A clerk's neat hand lists, field inspected. OK. Lanes marked OK. Litters OK. And hours later, a pilot is checking flaps, a navigator is spinning his E-6B, and a radio crackles a tower clearance in the same clipped cadence used on bombing runs. The Germans understood the arithmetic. When you face a nation that can bring thousands of aircraft to a fight and then bring hundreds to a rescue, resistance becomes math, not drama. That is why the last days around Bart felt like gravity has shifted west. Even on the ground, the American habit of over-preparation paid off. Zemke's staff had prioritized the sickest, staged blankets near prop wash for warmth, and pushed ambulatory men to the second flight line. The air crews who arrived from England found a camp that looked like a depot, not a jail. "Best seat in Europe," one Kriegi said as he claimed the waist window, and that line feels like the entire arsenal speaking. It is not arrogance to say the United States could do what no other belligerent in 1945 could do in that way, at that speed. It is simply the truth of volume and velocity. The same nation that had fielded the M1 Garand to every infantry squad, that had shipped sea rations by the millions, that had kept P-51Ds on the wing over distant targets, now poured that momentum into going back for its people. Holy shit, facts are often just tables read aloud. 8,500 lifted in 3 days, 450 flights. A bomber fleet turned into an air bridge with clipboards and wrenches. After the last takeoff, a German sergeant looked at the empty field and said, not unkindly, "Ihr Amerikaner habt die Zeit besiegt. You Americans beat time." That is the most honest concession of the war. The ledger closes and the comparisons cut deep. In German hands, roughly 1 American in 100 died awful, and a blessing compared to the Pacific, where about 4 in 10 captured Americans perished under the Imperial Japanese system. The difference is not a boast, it is a blueprint. Geneva rules were enforced more consistently in Europe. The Red Cross moved millions of parcels by rail and sea, and American camp organization turned those inputs into survival. When the winter marches came, the buddy system and ration math kept bodies moving toward Moosberg's wire instead of into snowdrifts. When liberation neared, the discipline that had been a burden at roll call became a runway for rescue. This is where pride belongs, in the way a free nation bakes humanity into its war machine and gets results that shock even the enemy. American POWs in German camps kept newspapers alive, kept schools open, kept worship and theatre running, habits of a civil society that do not shut down in bad weather. That culture produced measurable outcomes. Men ready to move, names already listed, weakest already identified, lanes marked, risks mitigated. Then the airplanes came. The same effort that had mass-produced B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, that had engine plants cranking out Wright Cyclones and Pratt and Whitney Wasps by the tens of thousands, flipped roles in a week and moved thousands of men. It is not magic, it is the ruthless kindness of a system that thinks ahead. Listen again to a POW line that belongs on a monument: captured, not conquered. That mindset makes the numbers possible. It kept a camp newspaper alive under raids. It backed an A.P. Clark when he said the task would be formidable, and did it anyway. It made a Zemke refuse an evacuation and posture a field for rescue. The Germans saw it and adjusted. Guards sought camp spokesmen when their own orders failed. The last lesson is cruel and clean. Values that work inside a fence will work outside a fence, and the world will notice. In 1945, a nation that could destroy a continent's war plants before lunch could also collect its sons by supper. That is not a metaphor. That is a timetable, and timetables, in war and peace, are where America lives. Bring it back to faces and ranks, because America's might is a chorus of names. Oscar G. Richard III, a U.S. airman who rode the track from capture to Dulag Luft to Stalag Luft, wrote with clean detail about the journey, how the first 60 hours rewire a life, how a barracks roster becomes a family. Hubert Hub Zemke, 56th Fighter Group Ace, turned a collapsing camp into an orderly handover by telling his men to hold fast and by trusting that help would land if he kept the runway human. A.P. Big S. Clark of Stalag Luft III led with lists, not speeches, and showed a generation that leadership is planning under pressure. James Bainham put the simplest words on the most complicated day. We couldn't wait to get a taste of freedom. Around them stand the quiet specialists who make miracles normal, the Ohio grocer who counted tins like inventory and kept the week alive by arithmetic, The chaplain who gave lament a schedule and hope a place to stand. The stagehand who built a footlight from wire so jokes could punch holes in the dark. The navigator who sketched a sectional on brown paper and called headings because calling headings felt like home. Each action is small until you stack them. Then you have a survival rate you can hand to a statistician and a rescue that looks like a production line. German officers were not fools. They were professionals in a doomed system who watched the men across the wire act like a town hall. When the marches started, they realized the columns moved cleanest when American NCOs set the pace. When the rescue came, they stood by fences and saw their last measure of control depart on 4 engines. One sergeant kept his cap on as the final fortress lifted and said simply, "Es ist vorbei." He was right, and the reason it was over was not just tanks and guns, but the habit of building order that follows American troops like a shadow. Put those names on the screen with their units and let the audience hear the cadence. 56th Fighter Group, Stalag Luft 3rd, Stalag Luft 1st, 8th Air Force, B-17, G, P-51D. It sounds like hardware, but it sings like heritage. The faces come home, thin but grinning, and the next scene is peacetime with a backbone families, classrooms, factories humming again. The greatest victory here is simple. People lived, because a free nation would not let them die. End with the ledger that reads like fiction and happens to be true. About 94,000 Americans fell into German hands. Roughly 1 in 100 did not come home, which means the rest did because training, Red Cross supply, and camp organization worked under stress. Between 13 and 15, May 1945, nearly 8,500 Allied POWs lifted out of BART on roughly 450 B-17 flights that taxied like a city schedule. A plant in Michigan had once produced a B-24 every 63 minutes. That same culture now produced a rescue in days. Survivors stepped onto scales at 128 pounds and watched the needle climb toward 170 under American care. That isn't sentiment, it's logistics meeting love. Now stack the holy shit facts. POW kept a free press alive behind wire. Stalag Luft, I ran school, worship and theatre, while winter tried to erase men. A. P. Clark moved contraband maps and compasses through searches he called formidable and built discipline that fed thousands. Zemke refused a suicidal evacuation, painted Amerikansky armbands, and staged a field so clean that bombers could land in sequence, load, and go. A navigator still flipped his E-6B because habits save lives. A pilot still checked flaps by feel because checklists never lie. A crew chief slapped aluminum like a friend and said, "One more," and then there was. The enemy's shock is the quiet line running under every scene. They expected broken men and found citizens building a town. They ordered marches and got columns paced by American NCOs. They tried to evacuate a camp and got a polite no backed by order and courage. When the last bomber lifted, the last lesson stood clear. You cannot beat a nation that treats character as doctrine and logistics as love language. It will outfly you in war and outcare you in peace. Close on the window seat again. A gaunt Kriegi leans into the waist opening and watches the Baltic bleach away in Sunday oil, salt, hot aluminum. The engine thrums at 2,300 revolutions per minute. And the pilot levels off. A little smile in the headset. The man at the window whispers, "Captured, not conquered." And this time, it sounds less like defiance and more like a report. He came home because America showed up. In training rooms, in tin stoves, in clipboards, in airfields, in factories, in the cockpit of a bomber now flying the easiest formation in history, straight line, westbound, full of freedom.